At the airport, my daughter said, "You're flying in cheap economy, while my husband and I are in first class. Don't come near us." I silently nodded. She didn't know that all the tickets were paid for by me. Right before boarding, I walked up to the counter and, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I have always believed that love doesn't need to be proven with receipts. You give because you love, not because you expect anything in return. That was the philosophy I lived by for 68 years. Through a marriage that lasted 31 of them. Through raising 2 children mostly on my own after Gerald passed. Through building a small but solid real estate business in suburban Connecticut that kept us all fed, housed, and comfortable. I was never a woman who kept score. Maybe that was my first mistake. My name is Margaret Elaine Whitford, and for most of my adult life, people described me as the strong one. Strong enough to bury a husband at 52 and keep showing up to work on Monday. Strong enough to put both my children, Claire and my son Thomas, through college without taking a single dollar of debt. Strong enough to smile at Christmas dinners even when the turkey was dry and the conversation was drier. Strength, I've learned, can be misread. Some people see it and feel inspired. Others see it and think, she doesn't need anything from us. She'll be fine. She's always fine. Claire was my daughter, my firstborn. 26 years of her life I watched unfold like something I was endlessly proud of. Her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking hard. I knew her before she knew herself, or so I thought. She met Derek Holloway at a corporate conference in Boston 3 years ago. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming. Smoothly, strategically, with just enough self-deprecating humor to make you lower your guard. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. But there was something behind his eyes that reminded me of a man calculating a tip before the meal was over. Still, Claire was glowing. What was I supposed to do? They married 14 months after they met. I paid for the wedding. Not because they asked. Well, Derek hinted, and Claire went quiet in that particular way she'd learned to go quiet when she wanted something, but didn't want to be the one to ask for it. The wedding cost $42,000. I paid it without a word of complaint. After the wedding, things shifted. Slowly at first, the way a house settles. You don't notice the cracks until a door stops closing right. Claire called less. When she did call, the conversations had a new texture, like she was reading from a script Derek had pre-approved. He started appearing on those calls, his voice in the background offering corrections. Tell her we need the deposit by Friday. Tell her we're looking at that condo in Stamford. Tell her. I became a resource to be managed. I paid the deposit on their condo. $60,000. A loan, Claire called it, though neither of them ever mentioned repayment terms, and I never pressed. Thomas, my son, who lives in Denver with his wife and 2 boys, called me after I told him. "Mom," he said carefully, "you know you don't have to do that." I told him I wanted to. At the time, I meant it. The warning signs I ignored would fill a notebook. The way Derek once referred to my business as Mom's little property hobby. The Christmas when Claire forgot to introduce me to their friends at a party, and when I gently brought it up later, she told me I was being oversensitive. The birthday, when my gift, a trip to Rome I'd planned for months, was received with a polite smile and a quiet question from Derek. "Is this refundable?" We were thinking about cash instead, but the moment that changed everything happened at Bradley International Airport on a Tuesday morning in March. We were flying to Florida together, or so I had thought. I had booked all 3 tickets, mine, Claire's, and Derek's, using my travel rewards account. The trip was supposed to be a peace offering, a chance to reset after a difficult few months. I upgraded Claire and Derek to first class as a surprise. I kept my seat in economy, thinking they might appreciate the gesture more than the proximity. I was standing near the check-in area, my carry-on beside me, when Claire walked up with Derek. She was wearing sunglasses she didn't need indoors and carrying a coffee she hadn't offered to buy me. She looked at my boarding pass and then at me, and something crossed her face. Something I still have trouble naming. Not embarrassment, not concern. Something cooler than that. "You're in economy?" she said. "Yes, sweetheart. I thought you two might enjoy—" "Mom," she cut me off. Her voice was quiet but sharp, the kind of quiet that carries. "Derek and I are in first class. We'd prefer to board separately. Have our own experience." She paused. "Please don't come over to our section once we're on the plane. It's a bit awkward." I looked at her. I looked at Derek, who was studying the departures board as though he'd gone suddenly deaf. I nodded. I said nothing. She didn't know, couldn't have known, that both of their first-class tickets had been purchased with my credit card. That the seat she was dismissing me from was mine to give and mine to take back. But I didn't say that. Not yet. I simply nodded, picked up my carry-on, and walked toward the gate alone. Some realizations don't arrive all at once. They settle into you slowly, the way cold does. First at the edges, then everywhere. Standing in that economy boarding line, watching the first-class passengers file through their separate door, I felt something I hadn't felt since the night Gerald died. Completely, utterly alone. And for the first time, I let myself think a thought I'd been refusing for years. She doesn't love me. She loves what I provide. The flight to Florida was 3 hours long. I sat in 24C, between a college student with headphones and a young father with a sleeping toddler on his lap. And I did not cry. I ordered a ginger ale I didn't drink. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I watched the cloud cover break over the Carolinas and thought about money, not in the anxious way I used to think about it when the business was young, but in the clear, unsentimental way an accountant thinks about a balance sheet. I thought about what I had given: the wedding, $42,000. The condo deposit, $60,000. The car I'd co-signed for Derek 2 years ago, when his credit score made the dealership hesitant. A decision that still made Thomas wince when it came up. The 3 loans, totaling $18,000 that had been absorbed into Claire and Derek's life without a trace of repayment conversation. The trip to Rome, I was now sitting far away from them to fund. I didn't include the smaller things, the grocery runs, the furniture, the envelope of cash I'd tucked into Claire's birthday card every year since she was a child, scaled up as my income had grown. I didn't count those because they hadn't felt like transactions. They had felt like love. Somewhere over South Carolina, I arrived at a number, just over $140,000 in 3 years. $140,000, and my daughter had told me not to approach her section of the plane. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from loss, but from recognition. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't sob. It just sits down beside you and waits, and eventually you have to look at it. I looked at it somewhere over Georgia. I thought about my mother, a practical woman from Western Massachusetts who used to say, "Margaret, people show you who they are when they think the bill won't come." I had always found that a little cynical. I didn't find it cynical anymore. What frightened me, and I want to be honest about this because fear is part of the story, was not Claire. It was myself. Because for a long moment on that flight, my first instinct was still to excuse her, to find the reason that made this okay. She's stressed. Derek influences her. She doesn't realize how it sounds. I had spent years building a library of excuses for my daughter's behavior, and I felt my mind reaching for the shelf out of sheer habit. I made myself stop. Because here is what I also knew, sitting in 24C with my flat ginger ale. I was 68 years old. My business, Whitford Property Group, 12 active listings, a staff of 4, 22 years of work, was currently valued at just over $2 million. My estate, including the house in Glastonbury and my investment portfolio, added another $800,000 on top of that. I was not a woman with nothing. I was a woman with everything to protect. And I had been protecting the wrong things. My plan came to me quietly, the way good plans do. Not in a flash of anger, but in a kind of settling. I didn't want revenge. Not yet. And perhaps not ever. Though I won't pretend the thought had no warmth to it. What I wanted was clarity. I wanted to understand exactly what Claire and Derek expected from me, and then I wanted to make decisions accordingly. The first step was simple. I needed to know what my current estate documents said. Gerald and I had written our wills together in 2003, and after his death, I'd updated mine to split everything equally between Claire and Thomas. That document was now 19 years old. I had never revisited it after the wedding. I had never thought I needed to. The second step was equally simple. I needed to speak to someone who was not emotionally involved, not Thomas. I loved him, but he had a tendency to leap to action before the picture was complete. Not Dorothy, my closest friend, though her counsel was usually wise. I needed a professional. I needed an estate attorney. By the time we landed at Tampa International, I had made two decisions. The first was that I would not confront Claire on this trip. I would behave normally, warmly even. I would give nothing away. The second was that on Monday morning, when we were back in Connecticut, I would call the law office of Patricia Okafor, who had handled Gerald's probate and whose number I still had in my phone. Claire and Derek met me at baggage claim. Derek was scrolling his phone. Claire gave me a brief hug and said the flight had been wonderful. Her cheeks were flushed from whatever they'd been drinking in first class. She didn't ask how my flight had been. Lovely, I said, and smiled. I'm so glad you two had a nice time. And I meant something entirely different by that than she understood. Patricia Okafor's office was on the 4th floor of a glass building in downtown Hartford. The kind of office that communicated quiet competence. No clutter, good light, a single orchid on the windowsill that was always in bloom. I had sat across from her once before, 11 years ago, when Gerald's estate needed to be settled. She had been direct and efficient then, and she was the same now. I appreciated that. I was not in the mood for gentleness. I told her everything. Not the emotional version, not the airport, not the ginger ale, not the grief over South Carolina. I told her the financial version, the $140,000, the unsigned loan agreements, the current state of my will, the business valuation. She listened without interrupting, her pen moving steadily across her legal pad. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you have any written documentation of the loans?" she asked. "No," I said. "They were informal." "And the wedding payment? The condo deposit?" "Gifts, no paperwork." She nodded, unsurprised. The good news is that none of that affects what we can do going forward. The question is what you want your estate to reflect. Your current relationship with your daughter, or the one you hoped you'd have? I thought about that for a moment. "The current one," I said. We spent 2 hours together that first meeting. Patricia explained my options clearly. I could amend my will to redistribute assets as I saw fit. I could establish a trust for my grandchildren, Thomas's boys, that would be insulated from any future claims. I could restructure how the business ownership was documented so that any inheritance of it came with conditions, such as a requirement that the inheriting party not have a spouse with financial interest in liquidating it. None of this was unusual. None of it was vindictive, legally speaking. It was simply responsible estate planning that I had neglected to do. I left her office with a list of documents she needed and an appointment for the following Thursday. What I did not anticipate was Claire, or rather, Derek. The trip to Florida had apparently prompted a conversation I hadn't been party to. 3 days after I returned home, Claire called me with a particular brightness in her voice, the kind she used when she was softening me up for something. She asked how I was feeling. She said Derek had suggested they come up for a weekend soon. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Derek had been looking into some investment opportunities and had wondered whether I might be interested in discussing my financial plans as a family. I said that sounded lovely and changed the subject, but it sat with me. Looking into investment opportunities, discussing financial plans as a family. I recognized the language. It was the language of people who had begun to worry that a resource might be reclassifying itself. The direct proof came 11 days later, and it came in the most ordinary way imaginable. I had driven down to Claire and Derek's condo in Stamford on a Saturday. Not because I had been warmly invited, but because Claire had mentioned the new kitchen backsplash and I had offered to come see it, wanting to keep up the appearance of normalcy. Derek was supposed to be at a golf game. He was not. When I arrived, I could hear them in the kitchen before I knocked. The door was slightly ajar. Old houses settle and old habits die hard, and I stood on the step for just a moment. Just long enough. "She changes the will. We get nothing," Derek was saying. His voice was not raised, which somehow made it worse. Raised voices are emotion. That was calculation. The business alone is worth $2 million. $2 million, Claire. We can't just let her— I know. Claire's voice, quiet, not protesting. "She's 68. She's healthy now, but—" I knocked. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Claire called out, "Mom, come in." She was standing at the counter when I walked in, her face arranged into a smile so practiced it was almost convincing. Derek was at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, a picture of casual Saturday morning. I looked at both of them. I smiled back. "The backsplash looks wonderful," I said. "I love the herringbone pattern." I stayed for 40 minutes. I admired the kitchen. I drank the coffee Claire made. Derek talked about golf. I gave nothing away. But in the car on the way home, driving north on I-95, I let myself feel it, the full weight of what I had just heard. We can't just let her. My daughter had said nothing to stop him. She had said, "I know." I had suspected. Now I knew. The difference between suspicion and knowledge is the difference between caution and action. I was done being cautious. I called Patricia's office from the car before I was even back in Glastonbury. I left a message saying I wanted to move quickly on the document revisions we'd discussed. By Monday, she had called back. By Wednesday, we were meeting again. The changes I made to my will were deliberate and thorough. Thomas and his wife, Renee, would now receive 60% of the estate, including the business, contingent on a management clause I worked out with Patricia to protect Whitford Property Group from being immediately sold. A revocable trust was established for Thomas's 2 boys, ages 7 and 9, with designated funds for education. Claire was not removed entirely. I was not willing to do that, not then, not without more time to think. But her share was reduced significantly, and it now came with conditions. It would be released in installments over 5 years with no lump sum. Any interest her spouse held in her inheritance was legally walled off. Patricia filed the amended documents on a Friday afternoon. The following Tuesday, Derek called me. He didn't lead with anger. He was too smart for that. He started with pleasantries. How was the garden? Had I seen the weather forecast? Funny thing, he and Claire had been talking. Then, "Margaret, I want to be transparent with you. Claire and I are concerned. We've heard, and I want to stress we don't know where this is coming from, but we've heard you may be making some changes to your estate planning." I kept my voice even. "Estate planning is a private matter, Derek." A pause. Of course it is. But as family— "I've updated my documents to reflect current circumstances," I said. "That's all I'll say." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, the pleasantness was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. Like a tablecloth pulled slightly to one side, just enough to see the edge of what was underneath. Margaret, I think it would be worth the four of us sitting down together. Claire is very upset. She feels like you're punishing her for something she doesn't understand. When Claire wants to speak with me, she can call me herself, I said. I'd love to hear from her. He hung up. Claire called 20 minutes later. She was crying. Real tears, or close enough that I couldn't tell the difference from the sound of them. She said she didn't understand what she'd done wrong. She said she loved me. She said Derek was just worried, that I shouldn't read into it, that he only wanted what was best for the family. She said the word family 4 times in 8 minutes, and each time it landed in me like a stone dropped into still water. I listened. I let her say everything she wanted to say. When she paused, I said, calmly and clearly, Claire, I love you. And when you're ready to have an honest conversation without Derek on the other line, I'm here for that. But I won't be discussing my financial decisions. She cried harder. She said I was being cold. She said I was acting like a stranger. I hope that's not true, I said. But maybe we've both been acting like strangers for a while now. I hung up. Then I sat in my kitchen for a long time, listening to the refrigerator hum, watching the afternoon light move across the tiles. 3 days later, there was a voicemail from Derek. His tone had changed. It was harder now, and under the hardness was something that sounded almost like a threat, though carefully phrased to be deniable. He said he and Claire had consulted someone. He didn't say who. And that I should be aware there were legal avenues available to contest estate changes made under undue influence or diminished capacity. He said he was raising this as a concerned son-in-law. He said he hoped we could avoid anything adversarial. I saved the voicemail. I sent the recording to Patricia by the end of the day. She called me back the same evening. This is actually useful, she said. If they ever do attempt a challenge, this is on record. I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, not quite, but a quiet steadiness. The kind that comes when you've stopped waiting for things to be fine on their own. I gave myself the weekend. I turned my phone face down. I walked along the river trail I used to walk with Gerald on Sunday mornings. I made soup from scratch on Saturday afternoon. I called Thomas, not to discuss any of this, just to hear about his boys. His youngest had lost a tooth. His oldest had made the school soccer team. I laughed and meant it. I was ready for what came next. They tried kindness first. I suppose I should have expected that. The package arrived on a Thursday, a wicker gift basket from a high-end shop in Greenwich, the kind of place where the cellophane alone costs $12. Inside, a bottle of Chardonnay I happen to like, a set of linen hand towels, lavender bath salts, and a card in Claire's handwriting that said, Mom, thinking of you. We miss you. Love always, C and D. The D was written in a slightly different ink, as if added after. I set it on the counter and looked at it for a while. Then I put the wine in the pantry and donated the towels to the church rummage sale. Derek texted the following day. Just wanted to make sure you received our little package. Hope you're well. We'd love to get together soon. No pressure, just family time. No pressure. I read that phrase 3 times. No pressure. He'd left a voicemail implying legal action 9 days ago, and now? No pressure. I did not respond. What I did instead was call Dorothy Crane, who had been my closest friend since we'd served on the PTA board together in 1994, and who remained, after Gerald's death and 2 of her own moves and a health scare in 2019, the most consistently honest person in my life. I told Dorothy everything. The airport, the overheard conversation, the voicemail, the gift basket. She listened the way only Dorothy listens, which is to say completely, without interrupting once. When I finished, she said, Margaret, how long have you known this was happening? I thought about it. Longer than I admitted to myself. Yes, she said. That's what I thought. Dorothy had been through something similar. Not with a child, but with a brother who had spent a decade managing their mother's finances and had done so selectively. She knew what it felt like to be slowly reclassified from a person into an asset. She also knew what it felt like to do something about it. She suggested I look into a support group. I almost dismissed the idea. I was not a support group person. I had always handled things quietly, privately, in the way of my generation. But Dorothy said it plainly. You need to hear from people who have been through this. Not because you're broken, because you're making permanent decisions, and you should know you're not the only one. I found a group through a local elder services nonprofit, a monthly gathering at the community center in Glastonbury called Family Dynamics Forum. The name was deliberately vague. What it was, in practice, was a room of 8 to 12 adults, mostly in their 60s and 70s, who were navigating complicated family financial situations. Some were dealing with siblings, some with adult children, some with spouses in early cognitive decline, and children circling the estate like anxious birds. I went once, told myself I was just observing, and spoke for 11 minutes straight when my turn came. The woman across from me, a retired nurse named Helen, 71, from Wethersfield, nodded at everything I said with the specific nod of someone who had lived the same story in a different house. Afterward, in the parking lot, she gave me the name of a financial advisor who specialized in protecting assets from family disputes. He's not cheap, she said, but neither is doing nothing. I made the appointment the next morning. The advisor's name was Robert Fenn. He was 50, direct, and had the useful habit of writing down what he said as he said it so you could take the notes home. He reviewed my current investment structure, the brokerage accounts, the business equity, the house, and identified 3 places where a determined challenger could theoretically create difficulty. He suggested restructuring the business ownership into an LLC with a clear buy-sell agreement, which would make it significantly harder to contest or liquidate without triggering legal penalties. He also suggested I document all financial gifts I had given over the past 5 years, not to pursue repayment, but to establish a clear record of what had been given voluntarily so it couldn't be later recharacterized. I spent 2 weeks working through his recommendations. I met with Patricia twice more. The paperwork was considerable, but with each document signed, each restructured account, each clause added to each agreement, I felt the ground beneath me becoming more solid. Derek and Claire were quiet during this time. No more calls, no more texts. Occasionally, a message would appear, a forwarded article, a photo of their new kitchen renovation, as though the previous weeks hadn't happened. I responded briefly and warmly to each one. I gave nothing away. I noticed that the quiet had a quality to it. It was the quiet of people who are watching, not people who have stopped caring. That was fine. Let them watch. By the time they understood what they were watching, it would already be done. They came on a Sunday afternoon in May, and they came together, which told me the visit had been planned. Claire called at noon to say they were in the area and would love to stop by. I said, of course. I made tea. I put out the good cups, the ones from Gerald's mother. I sat in the living room with my hands in my lap and waited for whatever this was. They arrived, looking their best. Claire in a cream-colored blouse, her hair done. Derek in a collared shirt, the kind of studied casual that announced effort. They came bearing a bakery box. He held the door for her. They sat across from me on the sofa, and Claire poured the tea with a warmth so deliberate it felt choreographed. For the first 20 minutes, it was pleasant. They asked about the garden. Derek told a story about a work conference that was presumably meant to be charming. Claire mentioned Thomas's youngest son's soccer team, something I had mentioned to her weeks ago, and she was now reflecting back at me to demonstrate she'd been listening. I watched all of it with the same calm I had been practicing. Then Derek set down his cup. "Margaret," he said, "Claire and I have been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of reflecting. And we want to say, first and most importantly, that we love you. We know things have been strained, and we take responsibility for that." Claire nodded. Her eyes were glossy. "Mom, I don't want us to be like this. You're the only mother I have," I said gently, that I loved them both and was glad they'd come. Derek nodded, as though I had confirmed something. "We think the tension has been partly because there's been some miscommunication about the future, about plans." He paused. "And honestly, Mom, can I call you Mom?" I nodded. "Mom, we're worried about you. Not about money, about you. Living alone in this house, managing the business, all of it. It's a lot for one person. We'd actually been thinking." He glanced at Claire, who looked at her teacup. "We'd been talking about whether it would make sense for us to be more involved. In the business, in your life, as support. So you're not carrying everything alone." And there it was. "More involved," I repeated. "Just in a supportive role," Claire said quickly. "Derek has a finance background. He could help with the business, take some of the day-to-day pressure off you. We're not talking about taking anything over, just being present," Derek finished. I looked at them both. I took a sip of tea. The room was quiet, except for the birds outside. "That's very thoughtful," I said. "Can I ask, and I only ask because I want to understand fully, what kind of role did you have in mind for Derek? In the business specifically?" Derek shifted slightly. "Nothing formal, just advisory. Someone you can talk through decisions with." "And would this be compensated?" A brief silence. "That wouldn't be the priority, no. It would be about family support." "I see." I set down my cup. "Derek, I received a voicemail from you in April in which you mentioned the possibility of contesting my estate documents on grounds of diminished capacity. Can you help me understand how that fits with what you're describing today?" The temperature in the room changed. Claire's face went very still. Derek's did not go still. His eyes moved, just slightly, in the way eyes do when a mind is moving quickly. "That was," he started. "That was said in a moment of frustration. I shouldn't have—" "I've saved the voicemail," I said. "My attorney has a copy." Claire turned to look at Derek. Derek's jaw was tight. "Margaret," he said, and the softness in his voice was mostly gone now. "I think you're approaching this with a lot of hostility that isn't—" "I'm approaching it with clarity," I said, "which I understand may feel similar." They didn't stay long after that. The Goodwise were clipped. Derek's hand on Claire's back as they walked to the car was firm, steering. At the door, Claire turned back, and her face, for just a moment, looked the way she used to look as a child. Uncertain, ashamed, aware that something had gone wrong. I held that image for a long time after they drove away. That night, I did feel afraid. Not of them, exactly, but of what was coming. Because I knew it wasn't over. And fear, I have found, is most useful when you let it sharpen you rather than still you. I stood in my kitchen at 8 o'clock in the evening and let myself be afraid, and then I decided what to do with it. I called Patricia and told her I was ready for the final steps. Patricia had suggested early on that if this situation ever escalated to the point of a formal challenge, the most effective protection would not just be documents, it would be witnesses. People who could speak to my mental clarity, my deliberate decision-making, and the timeline of events. She had advised me to document conversations, save messages, and, when the time came, make sure any final actions were taken in the presence of multiple parties. The time had come. I arranged what I described in the invitation as a family meeting to discuss the estate. I sent written notice to Claire and Derek by certified mail. I also invited Thomas and Renee, who flew in from Denver. I had finally told Thomas everything in one long phone call the week before, and his response had been quiet and furious, in the way that men who love their mothers go quiet and furious. He had said very little. He had booked flights the next morning. When I picked them up from Bradley International, Thomas hugged me longer than usual and didn't say anything, and I understood that he was saying everything. Patricia would be present. Robert Fenn, my financial advisor, would be present. Dorothy would be there as a personal witness. And because I wanted one person in the room who loved me simply, the meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning in June at my house in Glastonbury. Derek understood, I think, before they arrived. His texts in the days before had a quality I recognized: probing, careful, looking for the shape of what was coming. Just a family meeting? Should we bring anything? Is this about the estate documents we heard you filed? I had replied warmly each time. Just yourselves. His final text, sent the evening before, read, "Looking forward to clearing the air." I read it twice and set my phone face down on the nightstand. I did not sleep well that night. Not from fear, from focus. There is a particular kind of wakefulness that comes before something important, and I had learned to respect it rather than fight it. I lay in Gerald's old house, in the room we had shared for 24 years, and I rehearsed nothing. I simply let myself be ready. They arrived on time. Derek was in a suit jacket, which told me he'd spent time deciding what to wear, which told me he was uncertain. Claire looked pale. Thomas and Renee were already there, seated at the dining room table I'd set with coffee and the good pastries from the French bakery on Main. Patricia sat to my right. Robert Fenn at the end. Dorothy in the armchair by the window, knitting, which was both her genuine habit and, I suspected, a deliberate choice to project calm. I opened the meeting simply. I thanked everyone for coming. I said I had asked them here because I wanted to be transparent about decisions I had made regarding my estate, and because I believed clarity was more respectful than silence. Then I walked through everything: the will amendment, the trust for Thomas's boys, the LLC restructuring of the business, the financial gift documentation I had prepared, a clear, dated accounting of every significant transfer I had made to Claire and Derek over 3 years, totaling $143,000. Patricia confirmed the legality and completion of each document. Robert confirmed the financial restructuring. Thomas and Renee were silent throughout, listening. I had organized the documents into 2 folders, one for Patricia's records, one that I slid across the table toward Claire and Derek. Derek picked it up. He opened the first page, the gift accounting, and I watched his expression do something careful and controlled, the way a face does when the person behind it is deciding how to react rather than simply reacting. Claire did not reach for the folder. Derek interrupted twice. The first time to say that he and Claire hadn't been given enough notice to have their own counsel present. Patricia noted calmly that the notice period had been legally sufficient and that they had been welcome to bring an attorney if they wished. Derek looked at Patricia the way certain men look at women who are more prepared than they expected, with a flash of something ugly quickly smoothed over. The second time Derek interrupted, his voice had risen slightly, and he said, "I want it on record that this process feels coercive. Margaret has been influenced by outside parties, attorneys, so-called advisors, in a way that doesn't reflect her actual wishes or best interests." I let him finish. I did not rush. I folded my hands on the table and let the room be quiet for a moment because I had earned the right to take my time. Then I said, "Derek, I'd like to play something for the room." I opened my phone. I played the voicemail he had left in April, the one about legal avenues and diminished capacity. The room was very quiet as it played. Claire was looking at her hands. Thomas was looking at Derek. Dorothy had set down her knitting. Renee, who had never met Derek before this morning and had formed her opinion accordingly, was completely still. When it ended, I said, "I have made every decision in this process over the course of 4 months, in multiple meetings with 2 separate professionals, in a state of complete clarity. I have documented every step. If you would like to contest this on grounds of diminished capacity, you are, of course, free to do so. But I'd encourage you to speak with an attorney first about what that process would look like and what it would cost." Derek started to speak, stopped, started again. His composure, that smooth, practiced composure I had watched him deploy at dinner tables and holiday gatherings for 3 years, was failing him in real time. His jaw tightened. He looked at the folder still open in his hands, then at Patricia, then at Robert Fenn, then at Thomas. And Thomas met his gaze with the particular stillness of a man who has absolutely nothing to say to you and would like you to know it. "Claire," Derek said. Claire did not look up. "Claire," he said again, sharper. She looked up then, and she looked at him. And I watched something shift in my daughter's face. Something long overdue. Her eyes moved from Derek to me, and they were full of a complicated thing I still don't have a single word for. Grief and shame and recognition, all at once. It was the face she'd had at 7 years old, when she'd broken something valuable and stood in the doorway holding the pieces and knew she couldn't put it back. I had always loved that face, even then, because it meant she still knew the difference. She didn't speak, but she didn't defend him either. Patricia noted for the record that the meeting had proceeded without irregularity. We concluded at 11:42. Derek and Claire drove home in silence. I know this not from guessing, but from what Claire told me months later, when things between us had changed enough that she could say it without deflecting. She said she had not spoken the entire drive back to Stamford, that Derek had tried to explain himself, first calmly, then defensively, then with a pointed edge that she recognized as the version of him that appeared when he felt cornered. And she had looked out the window and let him talk, until eventually he stopped somewhere on I-95 just past Bridgeport, and the silence after was different from the silence before. It had a quality of something settled. She called me 3 days after the meeting. Not Derek, Claire. She called from her cell phone in the parking lot of a grocery store because, she said, she needed to be somewhere Derek wasn't. She didn't lead with apology. She led with a question. "Mom, how long did you know that you two were counting on my money?" I said. "I suspected for a year. I confirmed it the day I overheard Derek in your kitchen." She was quiet for a long moment. I want you to know I didn't plan any of it. He just started talking about it and You went along," I said. "I went along," she said, very quietly. "We talked for 2 hours that day. I did not forgive everything in one conversation. I'm not that kind of woman, and I don't believe in that kind of accounting. But we talked honestly, for the first time in years. She told me things about her marriage that I had sensed but never been told. He had been tracking her spending since before the wedding. He had, on at least 2 occasions, told her that her relationship with me was financially irresponsible, that I was the one enabling dependency rather than building something real. He had framed her love for me as weakness and called it practicality. He had, over 3 years, quietly made her feel that needing her mother was something to be managed and minimized, a habit to be gently corrected rather than a bond to be honored. She had been so relieved to be chosen by someone so confident that she had not questioned what the confidence was built on. It had taken sitting in my dining room, listening to his recorded voice fill the room, watching everyone around her see what she had been seeing and choosing not to name, for the architecture of it to finally become visible to her. I won't tell you I didn't grieve for her. I did. Not for the loss of her. She was still there, still reachable, but for the years of her that had been spent in a smaller version of herself than she deserved. That grief was real, and I sat with it. What happened next unfolded over the following months with the sort of quiet, administrative finality that real consequences usually have. Not drama, not confrontation, but paperwork and decisions and slowly closing doors. Derek formally consulted an attorney about contesting the will. The attorney, I was told secondhand, advised him that given the documentation of my decision-making process, the recorded voicemail, the presence of multiple professional witnesses at the estate meeting, and the clean paper trail Patricia had assembled, any challenge would be unlikely to succeed and would cost significantly more than the reduced inheritance he was contesting. The attorney also noted, according to what Claire later told me, that the voicemail itself could constitute evidence of bad faith on Derek's part if the matter proceeded to court. He did not file. The folder of documents I'd slid across the table had done its work before anyone had to argue about it. His advisory role ambitions for Whitford Property Group dissolved accordingly. There was nothing to advise. The LLC agreement made clear that no outside party could hold interest in the business without board approval, and I was the board. He had no foothold. He had never had one, but now the paperwork confirmed it in language that left no room for creative interpretation. 2 months later, Claire told me she had asked Derek to move out. She said she'd been thinking about it longer than she admitted to herself, that there had been a version of this decision living in the back of her mind for over a year. But that sitting in my dining room watching him perform indignation while the voicemail played had collapsed whatever was left of her willingness to excuse it. She got a therapist. She started, cautiously, rebuilding. She went back to the design work she'd quietly set aside during the marriage because Derek had found it impractical. The first time she sent me a photo of something she'd been working on, a residential renovation in Darien, warm and spare and exactly her. I printed it and put it on the refrigerator, the way I used to do with her drawings when she was small. As for Whitford Property Group, I brought on a new operations manager in September. A sharp woman named Anita, 44, who had been in commercial real estate for 15 years and who reminded me of myself at her age in ways that were both flattering and clarifying. With her help, I began the transition to a slightly reduced role. Not retirement. I wasn't ready for that, and frankly, I'm still not sure I'll ever be entirely ready. But the slower, more deliberate pace I'd been telling myself I'd allow when the time was right. I kept the house in Glastonbury. I started the Rome trip over, this time just Dorothy and me, booked in 2 comfortable seats next to each other in economy, which suited us both perfectly. The $143,000 I had given Claire and Derek, I let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because carrying it would have cost me more than the amount itself. The documented record of it exists. If I ever needed it, it was there. But I found I didn't need it. What I needed, it turned out, was the clarity that came after. The 2 years that followed were, in many ways, the most quietly alive I had felt since Gerald was well. Thomas and Renee flew east more often. The boys had grown into lanky, loud, wonderful creatures who filled my Glastonbury house with the particular disorder that only beloved children create. The older one, James, had decided he wanted to learn to cook and spent a Thanksgiving weekend following me around the kitchen with grave seriousness, writing down every step of my stuffing recipe in a notebook he'd brought specifically for the purpose. I framed the page afterward. It hangs in my kitchen, slightly smudged where he'd leaned over the counter. to watch me add the celery, and I look at it every morning without meaning to, and then find I'm glad I did. The younger one, Cooper, was all energy and questions. Why does bread rise, Grandma? Why does onion make you cry? Can we make pie? And I answered every question as seriously as he asked it, because children who ask questions deserve to be taken seriously. Gerald would have loved those boys unreservedly. I loved them enough for both of us. Dorothy and I did go to Rome. We went in October, the right month, when the tourists had thinned and the light on the old stone was amber and low. We walked until our feet ached and then sat at outdoor tables and ordered wine. We couldn't finish and talked about everything. Gerald, her late husband Frank, our mothers, the strange gift of being old enough to care less about what things looked like and more about what they felt like. One evening, we got slightly lost between the Pantheon and the Campo dei Fiori, and instead of being anxious about it, we simply kept walking and found a small restaurant on a side street where no one spoke much English and the pasta was extraordinary. Dorothy said it was the best meal she'd eaten in 20 years. I agreed. I bought a small watercolor of the Tiber from a street artist near the Ponte Sisto, a young man who painted with his whole body, leaning and stepping back, entirely absorbed. And it hangs in my hallway now, slightly crooked, exactly where I want it. The forum met monthly, and I kept going. I had stopped needing it for myself in the acute way I once had, but I found I had something to offer others who were earlier in their own reckonings. There is a particular usefulness that comes from having been through something and arrived on the other side with your clarity intact. Not wisdom exactly, just the settled knowledge that survival is possible and specific and not as distant as it feels from inside the difficulty. Helen and I became genuine friends, the kind that form late in life and are somehow more solid for it, built on honesty rather than proximity. She visited Glastonbury twice. I drove to Wethersfield for her birthday in October and stayed for dinner and didn't leave until nearly 11, which felt like a small triumph over the version of myself that used to leave parties early to avoid being too much. Whitford Property Group had a strong year. Anita was everything I'd hoped: precise, calm under pressure, and possessed of a confidence in negotiations that I recognized and respected. She had a way of making difficult clients feel heard while simultaneously not conceding an inch, which is rarer than it sounds and harder to teach. In December, I gave every member of my staff a meaningful bonus, not the rote percentage of salary kind, but a real one, sized to each person's circumstances, which I knew because I paid attention. My property manager, who had 3 kids and a car that was held together by hope, found an envelope with enough to replace it. He cried in the parking lot, which he told me about the next day with a sheepishness that made me want to tell him that crying over a kindness is not weakness, it's just being human. I told him not to thank me and meant it. Claire and I continued to build something back. It was slow. Real repair always is. And I did not pretend the airport hadn't happened, or the kitchen, or any of it. We did not gloss. We talked about the hard things in small pieces, at the right moments, and we let the easier moments be easy without demanding that they compensate for the hard ones. She was working again, at a design firm in Stamford, where she'd always been talented when she let herself be. She sent me photos of projects sometimes, rooms transformed, light reconsidered, space made to feel both larger and more human. And I could see her in every choice. Her eye had always been good. She had simply needed room to use it. She seemed, gradually, like a version of herself I recognized from before Derek. Not identical. She was quieter now, more deliberate, but recognizably, genuinely herself. I found I liked this version even more than the one I remembered. Derek himself had moved into an apartment in Bridgeport after Claire asked him to leave. I don't know much about his life there. I know he'd left the finance job for something in sales. I know he'd retained an attorney briefly and then released them. I know Claire told me once that he'd called her wanting to reconcile, that he'd been sorry in all the right words and had sent flowers twice, and that she'd said no both times with a steadiness that told me she had done the interior work required to mean it. I did not celebrate this, but I noted it. I didn't feel satisfaction about Derek's circumstances exactly. What I felt was relief, not at his difficulties, but at the proof that consequences existed, that the world was not entirely without accountability. I had been afraid, in some of my lowest moments, that I was wrong about all of it, that I had misread everything, overreacted, damaged relationships out of pride or fear or some failure of my own that I hadn't yet identified. The proof that I hadn't was not a trophy. It was simply solid ground, and solid ground after a long time without it is everything. The Sunday after James wrote down my stuffing recipe, the Sunday he flew back to Denver with his notebook and his brother and his parents, and the house went quiet again in the particular way it does after children leave, all that sudden stillness that is somehow louder than the noise. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked out at the yard where Gerald had always kept his tomatoes. The plants were long gone, but I had started a small garden of my own in the same spot. Late season, probably not enough sun, probably too ambitious. We'd see. I thought about the woman I'd been on that flight to Tampa. The woman in 24C, hands folded, flat ginger ale, counting what she'd given. I had given a lot. I had also, for too long, given in ways that hurt me without helping anyone else. That's the version of generosity I was done with. The kind performed out of love so tinged with fear that it couldn't tell itself apart from either one. I had learned to tell the difference, slowly, expensively, permanently. But I had learned. I finished my tea. I went out to the garden to check on the tomatoes. The most important thing I did wasn't changing my will. It was learning to stop explaining myself to people who had already decided what I was worth. Love and generosity are not the same thing. Love is the thing itself. Generosity is one of the ways it moves. But when giving becomes the only language that keeps someone close, that isn't love. That's a transaction wearing love's face. If you're listening to this story and recognizing something in it, I want to ask you honestly, how long have you known? How long have you been finding reasons to let it continue? You are allowed to protect what you've built. You are allowed to change. What would you have done? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Share this with someone who might need it. And thank you, truly, for spending this time with me.